Hi, I'm Harman Wiegert and I'm a sound designer for video games. During the Global Game Jam 2021, I did sound and music for Bark Souls, a game where you walk your dog in an online forest where you can communicate with other players only by placing emojis and whistling. I wanted to share some of the sound design decisions and implementation processes that went into the 48-hour-long development of the game. Hopefully you'll learn something new about video game audio or pick up something you can use in your own game. First off, the game is made in Unity, and for audio I chose to use Wwise, a popular audio middleware. This greatly increases the tools I have to design and implement audio, while also making it easier for me to implement the sounds. The tips and implementation I will show will be in the context of Wwise and Unity, but you can apply them in other engines and middleware as well. The things I will go over are the ambience and environmental sounds, footsteps, animation tagging and terrain checks, attenuation and reverb, and finally a little bit of music. And with all games it is very important to set the mood correctly, and a walk through a foresty mountain brings a certain type of expectation with it. With such a huge map as Bark Souls, I could have done a lot of time consuming things that would make the ambience very detailed, like placing bird sound triggers in trees, giving open areas a wind ambience zone, or giving each type of vegetation its own rustling sounds. But with game jams, the 80-20 rule is very important, since you only have time for the 20% that makes up 80% of the experience. So I started off with a simple blend container where I have two different ambience loops playing together. One of them is the sound of a forest during winter. And the other sound is just a cold wind loop sound. Now in Wwise, I linked both of the volumes of these sounds to an RTPC value, which is a value I can control in-game and thus change the volume of the sounds. The higher this value is, the more cold wind you hear and the less forest you hear. But when it gets lower, you go back to the sound of the forest and the cold wind fades away. Now I link this parameter to the Y value of the player, so the higher up on the mountain you get, the more cold wind you hear, and the lower you get, the more trees you hear. I then imported 28 bird call sounds and placed them in a random container and set it to trigger a random sound between 1 and 6 seconds. The sounds then get played in a sphere around the player and they get a little bit of reverb applied to them, so they sound like they come from far in the distance, like they're always out of view of the player. Finally, for the ambiences, there are a couple of spot ambiences, like a campfire and a windmill. In the game, walking is the main thing you do, so having some nice footsteps in there was extra important. I had a couple of good footstep sound files with distinct left and right footstep sounds. The difference between putting down your left and right foot is very slight, but once you notice it, you can't unhear it. In the files, I cut up each alternating footstep and put them in their own container. One for dirt, snow, wood, which wasn't used in the final map, and ice. Unfortunately, ice didn't have labeled footsteps for left and right, so I ended up throwing those all in the same container. All these different containers then get put into a single footstep switch container. This one container then triggers the corresponding footstep type depending on the value, which was set later in the game. I also added a bit of cloth foley to each footstep. I think foley is a bit like spice in cooking. You can eat food without it, but adding the appropriate amount of it really gives it another level. To trigger the footstep event, I made a little script that triggers an audio event in Wwise with a name we can set later. By having a single audio event trigger, we can make it way easier to reuse. I add the script to the player model and open its animations. Open up the walk animations and go to the frame where the foot hits the ground and press the little button to add an event. Now you can pick the play event function from the script and just put in the name of the Wwise event you want to play. Every time this animation reaches that frame in-game, the event will fire and the sound will play. This goes for both your own character and those of other players. You can also use a modification of this script to set values in Wwise. For instance, the sound of the dog panting is always looping, but the volume of it is controlled in the animations. When the dog runs, it is set to 1. And then when it goes into an animation other than running, it is set to 0. Wwise waits a couple of seconds before it sets the volume back to 0, and that's how the dog panting sound works. Anyway, back to footsteps, we still need to set up different terrain types. For such a big map, I didn't want to spend half the jam setting up colliders for different terrains, so I had to do some research for a solution. I ended up finding a tutorial on how to check which terrain texture the player is currently standing on, and use that info to change the ground type switch in Wwise. Whenever a footstep event is triggered, it will check what value of the ground texture elements are. Since these textures can blend together, I only change the switch if it is above a certain value, and default to a dirt sound if it isn't specifically snow or ice. Now you can blend all these different footstep sounds together, so you can have a half snow, half dirt step sound when you go from one ground type to another, but that would have required more time tweaking than it was worth. Next, something that is both very simple to set up, but also very important for the feel of the game: attenuation and reverb. Attenuation means reducing a value, and in audio it is used to describe how a sound changes over distance. The basics are: sounds get quieter the further you are away from it, but they also become less clear. Think of hearing a concert in the distance. It sounds muffled and indistinguishable. Reverb is the way the sound bounces around a physical space, and is very important to making believable audio. In Wwise and other audio middleware and audio systems, the source sound will be sent down two paths at once. One goes to a master output without any reverb or other effects on it, called the dry signal. And the other path goes through the reverb alone, and is called the wet signal. By mixing these two back together, you can change how reverby a sound is based on parameters you set in the game yourself. In our game you can whistle, and I wanted the player to be able to hear other players in the distance. I set this up by making the whistling sound never completely muted at a maximum distance, but I also mixed in a bit more reverb the further you are away from it. Reverb works especially good when you have contrast. A sound that is up close without reverb will sound closer when the far away sound has more reverb, like it's bouncing around the space a bunch before it hits your ear. Now, this is a very basic setup, and tweaking the right values in reverb and delays could have easily taken a whole day, but again, the 80-20 rule is very important. Just having generally fitting reverb in there made a world of difference. This attenuation curve got reused in a lot of sounds. Footsteps and volley got muted when they're far away though, and they have a much lower maximum distance than whistling and barking. Since hearing someone take a step across the entire mountain is not very important, and is also not very realistic. Finally, the music. I could probably spend an entire video on the choices and effects I use in this, so I'll just go over the most important things. The song only starts after you hear 6 seconds of ambience in the game, and the start and end of the song are very minimal. A lot of ambience is in game, and with this game being about walking your dog in nature, I wanted people to hear the natural ambiences too. Initially, the idea was to have the song only play once, but we soon found out that having no music at all was a bit too cold for some ears. So when the song is done and you place an emoji, a second loop will start. By having a bit of interactivity in the music, I wanted to make you feel more in charge and aware of the sound in the game. The song only uses a couple of instruments, and most of them are drenched in reverb and delay, to make it more something that blends in with the background and itself. It is meant as something that fills the soundscape rather than something that is front and center. I also based the initial piano melody of one of the bird calls in the game, to bridge the music and ambiences some more. Finally, by having repeating drum beats and chord progressions, I wanted it to drift into the background even more. By having it repeating the same musical idea but in different ways and with different instruments, it becomes repetitive in a not annoying way, like a bare 30 seconds loop would on its own. Finally, here are some little extra bits. The emoji interaction sounds are in the same key as the music, so it doesn't pop out as much. The dog footsteps are made by placing my hand on my carpet to simulate a light animal walking on snow. And the dog can have one of 4 different bark type sets that gets decided at random when it spawns. I hope you've learned something new about game audio, or picked up a new idea for your own game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next jam.